It all started on what I thought would be a quiet afternoon. I had just pulled up to check on a property I recently invested in when out of nowhere, a woman stormed toward me with that unmistakable HOA Karen energy. She didn't even ask who I was or why I was there. Instead, she launched straight into accusations, waving papers around and insisting I was violating her neighborhood rules. I calmly told her the truth, that I wasn't part of her hoe, and this land was completely outside their control. But the moment those words left my mouth, her face changed. She grabbed her phone, muttering something about calling the cops, certain she could force me into following her rules. What she didn't know was the one detail that flipped the whole situation upside down. I wasn't just some stranger moving in. I was the new landlord, and her own lease had just landed under my ownership. The irony was almost too perfect. While she dialed the police, sure she had the upper hand, I couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before reality caught up with her. The neighborhood was quiet, and a few curious neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, watching the scene unfold. It felt surreal, almost like a showdown, her fueled by misplaced authority, me holding back the truth that would change everything. With the cops on the way and Karen puffed up with confidence, I knew this was about to turn into more than just a heated conversation. The real question wasn't whether I could prove I wasn't in her hoe. It was how she'd react when she finally discovered that the man she was calling the cops on had just become her new landlord. And that's where things took a shocking turn. The cops hadn't arrived yet, but the tension was already thick in the air. Karen stood in the driveway, arms crossed, pacing like she owned the whole street. She kept repeating that I needed to respect the whole rules and that outsiders couldn't just do whatever they wanted. What she didn't know was that the house she lived in wasn't even fully hers. She had been renting it for years. I had quietly purchased the property through a deal with her former landlord just weeks earlier. The paperwork was signed, sealed, and legal, but I hadn't introduced myself to the tenants yet. In fact, this was supposed to be the day I finally did. As I stood there, I thought about how quickly things had escalated. I expected to shake hands, explain who I was, and discuss the lease details. Instead, I was being treated like an intruder. Her arrogance wasn't just annoying, it was fascinating. She truly believed she had power over me because of her hoe status, and she had no clue the balance had already shifted. The neighborhood itself seemed caught in the middle. A few people lingered on their porches, whispering as if they'd seen this kind of drama from Karen before. It was obvious she had a reputation for policing others, but this time she had picked the wrong target. Still, I didn't reveal my hand. I let her rant, knowing that every second she spent building her case against me would make her reaction later even more dramatic. When I glanced at my phone, I saw an email notification from my property manager confirming the final transfer of documents. At that very moment, while Karen was waiting for the police to arrive, I already had proof that I wasn't just outside her HOA's reach, I was about to be her landlord. The stage was set, and the real clash was only beginning. Karen's voice grew louder with every passing minute, as if raising her tone could somehow make her authority real. She paced up and down the driveway, pointing at my truck, pointing at the house, and repeating that her hoe doesn't allow this. It was almost comical because she didn't realize the house she was defending so fiercely wasn't even under the HOA's control anymore. Still, the energy she carried was enough to make the situation tense, and the neighbors were eating up every second of it. One man across the street leaned against his mailbox, shaking his head like he'd seen this exact performance before. A couple down the block quietly recorded with their phones, probably adding fuel to the gossip chain. It struck me that Karen wasn't just in conflict with me. She was in conflict with everyone around her. She had built a reputation as the self-appointed neighborhood enforcer, and now she was determined to prove she could put me in my place. But from my side, the conflict was more layered than she realized. This wasn't just about one confrontation. I had just invested in several properties in this area, and hers was the first tenant situation I needed to manage. The last thing I wanted was unnecessary drama with someone who could stir up the entire street. And yet, here she was, forcing a battle that she thought was about hoe power, but was really about landlord and tenant rights. Inside the house, I could see curtains shift, as if her family was watching but too nervous to step outside. That told me plenty. This wasn't just an Ho dispute. It was a pattern, and even the people closest to her seemed tired of it. Still, with police on their way, I knew the conflict was about to cross into a whole new level of tension. The flashing lights at the end of the street made everything feel heavier. The police car slowed as it turned the corner, and Karen immediately straightened up like she had just won a battle before it even began. She waved her arms to flag them down, pointing at me as if I were some kind of trespasser. Her confidence was almost too much to watch. Every word out of her mouth carried the certainty that she was about to get me thrown off her property. My heart was steady, but I could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about an Ho complaint anymore. This was about control, about reputation, and about the truth that was seconds away from colliding with Karen's version of reality. I stayed calm, letting her talk over me, knowing that every sentence she threw at the officers was just digging her deeper into a situation she didn't understand. The neighbors leaned in closer now. Phones were up, whispers traveled fast, and the entire street had turned into an audience. Some were smirking, some were wide-eyed, and a few shook their heads like they already knew she was setting herself up for humiliation. The air carried that strange silence that only comes right before something big happens. One of the officers finally looked in my direction, asking for my side of the story. I reached into my bag slowly, pulling out the documents I had been carrying just in case this exact situation came up. The timing was unreal. Karen kept interrupting, insisting I didn't belong, that the Ho didn't approve me, that I was violating every possible rule. Her voice cracked as the officer held up a hand for her to stop. All eyes were on me now, and the moment of truth was hanging by a thread. Just as I held out the paperwork, ready to clear everything up, Karen did something that shifted the entire mood. She pulled out her own folder, stuffed with Ho documents and letters, waving them like they were proof that she had the final word. She shoved them toward the officers, insisting that her authority as part of the Ho outweighed anything I might show. For a moment, even the officers looked caught between two competing stories, and the tension doubled. The twist wasn't in her papers, though. It was in what she revealed without realizing. As she rattled off her evidence, she mentioned an ongoing dispute with the previous landlord, claiming she had been pushing for ownership rights through some loophole the Ho had promised her. That caught my attention immediately. Not only was she overstepping with her Ho claims, but she had been trying to maneuver herself into controlling a house she didn't own. The fact that I had purchased it out from under that dispute made the entire situation even more explosive. The neighbors gasped at her words. A few even muttered out loud, clearly shocked that she had been hiding such a scheme. Suddenly, this wasn't just a clash between tenant and landlord, or between homeowner and Ho. It was about someone who had been trying to manipulate the system for her own gain, and she had accidentally exposed it in front of everyone. The officers exchanged glances, one raising an eyebrow as if realizing there was a much bigger story unfolding. I held my documents tighter, knowing I had every legal right on my side, but also realizing that if I revealed everything now, the fallout would be massive. The street felt electric, the suspense unbearable. Karen thought she still had control, but she had no idea how close she was to losing everything. The officer finally turned to me and asked to see my documents. I handed them over calmly, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. As the officer flipped through the pages, Karen kept pacing, throwing in comments about fake papers and illegal ownership, but her voice grew shakier the longer the officer read. Within moments, the officer looked up and stated clearly that the deed, lease agreements, and transfer of ownership were all in my name. The property was mine, legally and without question. Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't process what had just been said. The neighbors who had been filming nearly burst into laughter, but the officer kept things serious, telling her that Ho rules didn't apply here at all. It was the moment everything flipped. Her confidence drained away as the reality set in. She hadn't just called the cops on a new neighbor. She had called them on her new landlord. I finally spoke, steady but firm, explaining that I had purchased the property weeks earlier and that she would be hearing from me soon regarding her lease. The shock on her face was priceless. All that authority she had tried to hold over me vanished in an instant. But just as the tension seemed to settle, the final twist came. The officer mentioned something I hadn't expected, that there had already been multiple complaints filed against her by other neighbors, some even tied to harassment and misuse of HOA power. Suddenly, this wasn't just my problem anymore. Karen wasn't simply facing me as her landlord. She was facing a neighborhood ready to hold her accountable. The climax had landed. What began as her attempt to control me ended with her losing control of everything around her. After the officers left, the neighborhood seemed to breathe again. The flashing lights disappeared down the street, but the whispers and murmurs remained. People who had been watching from their porches slowly stepped back inside, though a few stayed just long enough to give me a nod or a smile. It was clear that many of them had been waiting for someone to finally stand up to Karen. And in a way, the truth had spoken louder than anything I could have said. Karen herself retreated into the house, slamming the door behind her without another word. For someone who had been so loud and certain only minutes earlier, the silence was telling. She now knew the hoe had no control over me, and worse, she had no control over the property she was living in. That moment of realization changed everything. Over the next few days, I received emails and calls from other neighbors, thanking me for handling the situation calmly. Some even shared stories of how Karen had tried to enforce rules that didn't exist or use the hoe to intimidate people. It was eye-opening to realize how much frustration had been building up in the community. When I finally sat down to review her lease, I knew I had decisions to make. Being a landlord wasn't just about owning property, it was about setting the tone for how people were treated. Karen's behavior had caused chaos for too long, and now she would have to face the reality that her actions carried consequences. In the end, the entire ordeal became more than just a property dispute. It was a reminder that power built on intimidation doesn't last. Real authority comes from respect, honesty, and knowing when to stand your ground. And in this case, the truth spoke louder than any hoe threat ever could.